Not surprising, though, perhaps. Hit number 8. Male intimate partner violence does not always escalate, despite what we've been told. And in fact, injuries are highest, as we've talked about a bit already, in reciprocal violent relationships. Feld and Strauss in 1990 conducted one-year follow-ups with 420 respondents from the American National Family Violence Survey. And what they found is actually more evidence of de-escalation of escalation when there was no intervention. Johnson also reanalyzed this data, and he found that among individuals, among husbands who had perpetrated no acts, 2.6% escalated in that follow-up period. Among individuals who committed at least one minor act of violence, 5.8% escalated. And among those who committed severe violence in the one-year period, 30% had recidivated, which is exactly consistent with the 2/3 rate that we already saw with regard to the interventions. Our take on this has been that the canon, the perspective that male violence will always escalate if unchecked because all men are attempting to control, dominate their partners, is actually not supported by any of the empirical literature that we were able to find. Here, what we see, again, is the injury occurrence in reciprocal and non-reciprocal relationships. And in fact, the female victims of non-reciprocal violence experience less violence and a lower likelihood of injury than women who are in reciprocally violent relationships. So if you imagine the circumstance where you have a very patriarchal, this is hypothetical, you've got this very patriarchal man who's dominating the relationship, that is what's theorized to be the most dangerous circumstances. But in fact, it comes back to the perspective that this is really about couple dynamics more than it is about patriarchy. Hit number 8, there is no evidence of widespread approval of wife abuse. They've done several surveys using this type of question. Are there situations that you can imagine in which you would approve of a husband slapping his wife's face, or a wife slapping her husband's face? And surveys demonstrate consistently that although awareness of the problem of intimate partner violence has developed, this largely has focused on an appreciation of this being a social problem or a health problem for women, not for men. So what we see is that when you compare the data from 1975 to 1985, there's a substantial decline in public approval rates for men using a slap against a female partner, but we see no significant change in approval ratings for women slapping their partners. And all you have to do is turn on your television between 7 and 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night. Romantic dramas, comedies, the man is the punching bag, he is the target of the jokes, she is the one putting him down, and I'm not exaggerating, it's something, and I pointed out repeatedly to my friends and family, and they now do it as well. It's quite surprising when you start to pay attention to it. There's a real disrespect for males developing in society, and I think we need to catch this before the pendulum swings any further. In 2001, Simon and colleagues used this same question in, again, a nationally representative sample of over 5,000 individuals. And what they found is that nearly 10% of men, 7.2% of women approve of a man hitting a woman, even if she hits him first. So we want to take those numbers down, there's no question, but this is not demonstrating that the majority of women believe it's appropriate and useful to use physical aggression against their partners. 2.1% of men and 1.4% of females believe that it's appropriate to do this to keep a woman in line, so even smaller numbers when you ask that in that manner. The corresponding figures there for female respondents, 38% of men approve of a woman hitting a man if he hits her first, 5% approved of her hitting him to keep him in line. Female respondents are 27% and 4.4%. More recently, from the International Dating Violence Study, and again, this is a younger population, it's based around 32 different nations, and these are university students. And I'm taken back by the findings, but they found much greater acceptance of female perpetrated than male perpetrated minor violence by women in all but one of the 32 nations. So in fact, even when we look at cultures where patriarchy actually probably is much more predominant than in North American settings, even there, this is not an accepted, appropriate response for dealing with your partner. I think what we're seeing is that the data clearly supports a concern about the public messages that we're sending out about aggression and about relationships. We're not acknowledging the importance of not using abusive tactics against males. The message is starting to get out there with regard to women, but I don't think we've done a good job of doing that with regard to men. The last point, hit number 10, efforts to reduce intimate partner violence have neglected half of the victims and half of the perpetrators. Declines in the actual rates of partner violence, not surprisingly, are consistent with what we saw on the last couple of slides with regard to attitudes. The American data from 1975, 1985, and again from 1992 show substantial decreases in the rates of severe assaults of women, but no change for women's perpetration of abuse against male partners. Similarly, we can see from national crime data very consistent findings. Male perpetrated partner violence between 1993 and 2004 was reduced, but there was no concomitant reduction in female perpetrated aggression. Between 1993 and 2003, we saw a slight increase in female perpetrated violence between 2003 and 2004, and that's in the American setting as well. When we look at Canadian data, rates of male perpetration show a slight decline between 1999 and 2004, whereas female rates have remained relatively stable. Basically, what we've concluded, and this is very self-serving, obviously. This is a book that a colleague, John Hamel, and I put together a while ago, but it sort of really challenges the notion of patriarchy as the underlying issue here, and challenges practitioners and researchers and policymakers and the courts to take another look at the issue and think about this from a gender-inclusive perspective, if you will. I think our basic thesis is that the idea that a single ideology, a one-size-fits-all approach to all relationships that experience abuse is probably not supported. And I think you would probably agree. If you think about any other clinical population, if they were presenting, you would do a thorough individualized assessment of the circumstances, the context that brought that person to your office. We wouldn't treat everyone with the same medications or with the same intervention approach. And in the same way, I think we need to reconsider what we're doing with domestic violence perpetrators and victims. The paradox of this feminist perspective or the patriarchal perspective is that I think what it's done is actually continued to place women and children and of course men at ongoing risk. And I think 3 points make this important. First of all, meta-analytic work demonstrates that women's perpetration of abuse is actually one of the most, in this case, in that meta-analysis, it was the most important risk marker for their victimization risk. Again, we saw in Whitaker's research that reciprocal violence actually has an adjusted odds ratio of 4.4 for increasing the likelihood of injury. So it suggests that our interventions should really be targeting both partners, and we should be addressing de-escalation. What are the triggers that set people off? What are the communication skills? Couples therapy obviously is not appropriate for that 5 to 8% of patriarchal, terroristic, severe forms of aggression. But when we're talking about the other 90% of abusive relationships, we need to be more creative and need to apply cognitive behavioral therapies and substance abuse treatment, group therapy, whatever is resource appropriate and appropriate for the individual couple. Something that I just wanted to touch on, because I feel very passionate about this issue, is that child abuse has really been treated as sort of a separate issue from intimate partner violence. And the reality is that we're leaving children in these very dysfunctional, heated family dynamics. These family systems obviously also have the issue of resulting in the intergenerational transmission. So we estimate that about 50% of families that have intimate partner violence are also experiencing child abuse. And that's not to suggest, again, that the males are primarily the ones responsible for this. There's a high rate of female perpetrated child abuse, obviously. And we know from a wealth of literature, not only from the domestic violence field, but more generally from the general offending and forensic psychiatric and psychological literatures, that being the witness of intimate partner violence or being the direct victim of child abuse itself puts these people at risk of perpetration, again, not only of intimate violence, but of diverse forms of offending and aggression. How am I doing for time? Okay. Just very quickly, I could leave it there, but just very quickly, what this suggests is that we really need to look at evidence-based practice. Treatment-mandated programs actually do not focus on the issues that we've talked about. So secondary programs, we want to be looking at personality disorder, cognitive and behavioral and emotional underpinnings. There are programs available. But ironically, they are excluded from state-mandated interventions. You are not allowed to use any form of intervention except the Duluth model, which is based on patriarchal explanations that are not supported by the evidence. Secondly, primary prevention, I think, is something that we need to be giving a lot more attention to, thinking about what we can do to prevent the initiation of this form of relationship difficulties. Public education programs need to acknowledge the importance of preventing all family violence, not only male perpetrated. From a theoretical perspective, it helps to acknowledge that physical violence is wrong in any case, in and of itself. But from a practical perspective, it helps to focus us on the appropriate forms of prevention. Justice, health, social service personnel, for example, need to be focused on violence that results in or has the probability of physical injury. Part of the reason we should be thinking about primary prevention is that even minor forms of aggression obviously can escalate into severe partner abuse. And so I think that should be our starting point. I'll leave it there.
Bye.